Now let's start diving into the specifics of screw chillers, how they control, what they do. There's a lot to discuss throughout this module, so just hang tight, hold on, and we'll try to cover each thing as best we can. And if you have any questions, just feel free to put those in the comments, or better yet, it's even better if you go over to the community group and put whatever questions you have there. And then from there, we can discuss. I can provide additional feedback, additional answers, and we can go from there on getting you the exact answer that's going to help you the most. So the overall chiller from a plant perspective is going to control and stage just like a normal chiller would. You're not going to see any differences. Anything is going to be happening differently there than what you are already going to be used to with any other chillers we've already covered, whether it be scroll or reciprocating. So from a chiller staging and lead lag process. Now, getting deeper into the compressor side, we're still going to be controlling our compressors based off of leaving water, which is going to be have a PID, a PID, or just another term for an algorithm, in order to decide how much and how fast to ramp the compressor up or down in order to meet load on the leaving water side. So we're going to start off with a very basic example. This one here behind me is out of a RTAA. This was one of the OG early edition of screw machines coming into the market. They've gotten far more complex from here, but that's okay. We're going to talk about those. Let's start off with just the basic. Here's what it was in the beginning. And we're going to look at it from just a single circuit perspective. We have just one compressor, which this would be comparable to, say, an RTHD. Now, instead of showing you an RTHD in the schematic, I felt this one was far simpler, and the only difference would be you change out the condenser. So now RTHDs have much more complex oil management circuits, and there's a lot more going on there, but they're just one compressor. And so there are going to be some screw chillers that you come across that they are just one compressor, maybe a very large compressor. And RTHD is an example of that. A YVWA is an example of that. They're one single compressor. They're just really big, and that's how it's able to control. Actually, I'm not sure. The YVWA, I have to look that one up. That one may come in a 2-compressor package, but I'm familiar with it in a single compressor. Anyway. Let's dive into that here. So ultimately, we have our leaving water side. The chiller is going to register that our leaving water is not making set point, and so at that time, it is time to call on the chiller. We've already got start stop. We've proven flow. Pumps are running. All of that has happened. Our ambient is above our minimum for operation, so it's time to bring on the chiller. Now, it's time to bring the compressor on. So these compressors are going to stage on fully unloaded. Now, something to know about screws is they have a slide valve. Now, you can see, we'll go over the specifics and the details about screw design, but over here by the motor is your suction side. We're going to pull into the compressor this way and up into the inlet side of our screw bolts. And then that's going to compress through and out into our discharge. And we have this little valve up here. It's called a slide valve. This mechanism is going to control how much load gets put on the compressor. So at startup, this slide valve will be in a fully unloaded position, which in this particular case, it would mean it'd be slid all the way fully forward, where it's got kind of the ghosting here. That would be the fully unloaded, which means that these little bypass ports are allowed to bypass around the rotors, and this back piece is not able to make compression. We're only allowing compression on part of the rotor assembly. So once the compressor gets turned on and has a minimum run time of a couple of minutes, it's going to register that the refrigerant circuit is stabilized just based off a time delay. There's nothing fancy going on there. And then it's going to see that, hey, we're still not meeting our leaving water set point. So at that time, this particular one uses oil. So as part of the oil circuit, it's going to use that oil and these loading valves to manually push or physically push the slide back and forth. So it'll slowly fire every few seconds that solenoid and just bump this valve over bit by bit until it eventually either reaches set point or if it hits some other limiting factor. And we'll talk about staging limits in a little bit, a low pressure, high pressure, and a current limiting. But short of it having a limit as it's trying to load, it's going to just slowly bump that over in the attempt to make leaving water set point. So in a single compressor setup, short of it just being a very high load that it's beyond the chiller's maximum capacity, it's reasonable to say that once it gets somewhere in the middle section here, it will stall out, or it's going to stop pushing the load valve over, or the slide valve, and we're just going to maintain the load where we're at right there. We don't need to go any further. And so that's where this really separates itself from the other compressors. What this one compressor is able to do the volume, and we're talking, this can be done up to several hundred tons, 3, 4, 500 ton machines with just one large compressor, not an RTAA, but like an RTHD can handle those kind of loads. It's a very, very large compressor. And so our ability to move that slide valve, we're not having to slow the motor speed. It's not doing anything in this particular case, even though it could be. And we'll talk about variable speed in a minute. But that slide valve from a basic compressor design is able to have immense control on this compressor's capacity in order to just maximize efficiency. We get huge amounts of CFM through the compressor without having to affect the motor and have any kind of speeding up, slowing down, anything of that nature. And we can dial how much the compressor is compressing very, very finely. And as you've seen with scrolls and with reciprocating, we just don't have that level of control. It's just not that refined. And from a control standpoint, short of the safety limits, it is that simple for these. That slide valve is just going to get pushed back and forth in order to maintain our leaving water set point as close to set point as possible. Now, that's if it was a slide valve scenario. If this didn't have a slide valve, it could be just a variable speed. So that's the other side of this. We have a lot of systems out there that have moved away from slide valves and have gone full-blown variable speed with no mechanical slide. And at that point, instead of the slide being pushed all the way into a unloaded position, it's just going to start at a minimum speed set point. And that varies based on the compressor. So a York YCIV, for example, their minimum speeds, I think, are 50 or 60 hertz, but those are 200 hertz motors, give or take. There's a little bit of fluctuation there. But for the most part, those ramp up to right at about 200 hertz at the top end, and that's their full speed. And that's what they're designed for, even though we're used to seeing, it's still like the overall chiller is still a 60 hertz chiller. You're still feeding at 60 hertz from the grid to it, but because the manufacturer has complete control of the motor and the drive package, they're putting in the 200 hertz output, and having that extra hertz gives much more refinement in speed control. But it also, from what I understand at least, the higher hertz allows better efficiency with the load and the torque on the motor, is my understanding. Regardless, we would start at a minimum speed, okay? This is also true even for, like, say, an air handler. Air handlers would, when we're dealing with an air handler in, like just a chill water air handler, okay? Those have a minimum speed. Most of the time, it's about 20, 25 hertz. You don't want to run them any slower than that. And you don't want to leave them sustained at that speed for a long time either, because that's really not that good for them. You want them to be able to ramp up a little bit, and a nice sweet spot, if you're from a ramp down perspective, is somewhere like mid 30s into the 40 hertz. You could run that sustained without any big issues. And then obviously just 60 hertz is full speed. But the concept of a 60 hertz motor, minimum needed is 20 hertz, would be a similar concept to whatever the hertz of our compressor is. We just have to have a minimum starting hertz in order to maintain the minimum compression we can and rotation, so that our oil flow is maintained and our motor cooling is maintained. So, because all these are suction cooled, or the vast majority of these are going to be suction cooled. And when we get into compressor design, we'll talk about some of the other cooling options like liquid injection. We start to see that introduced at a screw level, which is not something we would typically see on a chiller system with the, say, a scroll or a reciprocating. So to recap that, when the chiller needs to bring the compressor on and we have our leaving water, we're going to move our slide valve, if it is slide driven, all the way to an unload, and then we will slowly load the compressor until we achieve our leaving water set point. If this was variable speed, which typically means we're not going to have a slide valve, not always, we'll talk about that later, but if it was variable speed and that's all we had, then we're going to start the motor at a minimum speed, and then we're going to slowly ramp the compressor up in speed until we achieve our leaving water set point that we're trying to hit. And that would be a single circuit control. So what about when we get into a multi-circuit or dual circuit, which it's pretty typical to see as many as 4. On a larger scale, you're pushing, the 500 tons at that point. So it just kind of depends on the plant and how big a systems they're running. It's pretty common, a lot of industrial plants, they're going to have the larger 400 to 500 tons, which means you're going to be dealing with 3 to 4 compressors typically. For most of these, from an air-cooled perspective, at minimum, you're looking at probably, even the small, say RTAA. So any time with an air-cooled, you're probably going to be looking at a dual circuit regardless. So even on the smaller scale, getting up into the larger ones, that's just how they did it. Now on the water-cooled side, you'll see them put a larger compressor in, and you'll see them go single compressor, single circuit. But you won't see that on the air-cooled side. It'll almost always be a dual circuit. And then I'm not aware of any that run more than 4 compressors total once you get to the largest sizes. So 3 to 4 is going to be the top end. Anyway, from a multi-circuit, it doesn't matter whether this is 2 compressors or 4 compressors, the overall sequence will remain the same. So one of the things is, we're going to choose our lead lag just as we've done before. So whichever compressor has the least amount of starts is going to be our compressor to get to run first. So if we have compressor 1, compressor 2, and compressor 2 has less starts than compressor 1, then the control system is going to automatically choose compressor 2 to be the first one on. It is our lead. And here's where something is going to get a little bit different. So with some of our other, or with a scroll or reciprocating, typically we would try to get both circuits online as soon as possible in the staging sequence. With screws, that same line of thought isn't followed. So what will happen? So we've registered that on our leaving water, we need to get to set point. Right now we don't. Everything else is satisfied. All of our safeties are satisfied. It's time to turn a compressor on and make some cold water. So to do that, we're going to start compressor 2 as our lead. This particular one's a variable speed. It doesn't matter. We've already talked about variable versus slide. So either way, we're going to start at a fully unloaded state, whatever that means. And the compressor is going to slowly ramp up, just that first compressor. And when we get to the point where the system is registered that compressor has maxed out, it is ramped as far as it's capable of going, and we can't put any more load on it, but we're still not making our leaving water set point. Then we will decide to bring on one of the lag compressors. So let's say circuit 1 was our lag 1, and we could have a lag 2 or lag 3 depending on how many compressors. So let's say lag 1 was compressor 1. So lag 1 would get started, and it's going to start to ramp up. Now this is where, depending on the manufacturer and the design, it will change on exactly how they manage this from a staging perspective. So when we get both compressors on, we want them to be balanced most of the time. But let's say from a York perspective, I'm going to use a YCIV as an example. So if circuit 2 is fully loaded and running at max speed, and then it's time to bring on circuit 1, it will ramp circuit 2 down to a minimum speed, unload it, it will unload it, and then bring on compressor 1, and the two of them will ramp up evenly together simultaneously, and they'll match between the circuits. Now that's got a few different reasons as to why, but the point is that's how York is doing it. Now Train, on the other hand, with some of theirs, what they'll do is, say, like, I'll use an RTAA as a really simple example. Compressor 2 will just stay at full load. It'll start compressor 1 and start to bring it in and load it. As compressor 1 is coming in to load, it will start to back down compressor 2, and eventually it will try its best. Like the two of them will eventually meet in the middle in terms of how much they're loaded in trying to produce cold water. And then once it gets down to the minimum loads and it's time to shut that compressor back off, say shut 1 back off, then it'll turn it off in the sequence, and then compressor 2 will start to load back up. And that exact process is completely true regardless of the number of compressors. And don't get too bamboozled by all the piping and stuff going on here. There's a lot that happens inside of these machines. We're going to break all this down. I want you to focus on how the compressors are being controlled in terms of a staging to load and unload them correctly. You read Carrier, so this schematic is out of a 30 XV manual. And you read, so these are variable speed compressors. They have no mechanical slide. And you read how Carrier describes it, and what they'll do. And I guess this is true to how they did it with the 30GX series as well before they went to the XV. Circuit 2, sticking with the same lead. Once it gets to maximum, it's going to stay there and it's not going to back down. Then it's going to bring on compressor 1 as lag. It's going to ramp up until it gets to whatever it needs to hit set point. And then as the load falls on the system, it will slowly back down circuit 1 as the lag, but it will not touch circuit 2. Circuit 2 as the lead will stay at full speed. And then circuit 1 until it's able to back down and completely pull out of the circuit. And then at that point, it'll stage circuit 2 upward, well, at that point down, because it should already be at full capacity and it should stay there. So then it would just need to stage it down as needed in order to match whatever the load requirements are. My point is saying this is there is not a concise way that the manufacturers are controlling a multi-compressor, which is what you're going to be dealing with the vast majority of the time. There's not a lot of consistency there. I just gave you 3 different brands, and they all 3 control it different ways. Dun & Bush does something similar to what Train does, where the lead that's already on is going to stay loaded. It's going to start the lag, and it's going to let it start to ramp up as the lead will start to ramp down, and they'll eventually kind of level out somewhere in the middle. You just be mindful that depending on the brand, you could have a different control sequence. And the first time you're in front of a York and you hear it go to stage up and that compressor just takes a nosedive on you, because these are very loud compressors. You can't miss them. If you're not prepared for it and you don't know what's happening, it's a bit spooky. I remember my first time. I was standing. It was in front of a YCIV, and it was the very first one I got in front of, and it was staging up, and all of a sudden it just takes that nosedive, and I took a couple of steps back, and I'm just looking at this thing. What the heck did it just do? And then I hear the next compressor start to spin up and come on, and they start to come back up. And at that point, it was fairly clear to me. It's like, okay, well, that was the staging sequence. That was weird, but I hadn't seen that prior to running into that YCIV, because they didn't do it that way, to my memory at least, with, like, say, a YCAS. They did it more like what Train and Dun & Bush are doing anyway, without going further into the weeds there. So I do want to just hone in on the fact of one of our goals with the other machines, it was to maximize efficiency, and that's why we wanted to get both circuits online together. But that same control logic is not true with screws. So we will do our best to run the minimum amount of compressors possible at all times. And even if that includes to mean that if one compressor being able to ramp up to almost full capacity is able to maintain the load, we will do that with that machine, and never even try to bring on a secondary compressor to help it or get the whole evaporator activated. Because a lot of these, so the 2 most common evaporators, so you're not going to be dealing with brace plates and stuff, and we'll get into this in more detail, but you're going to be DX or flooded, or falling film actually is the most common. So falling film and DX, and there are some floodeds out there, so those will be your 3 most common. If whatever circuit is not running, that part of the evaporator is just not activated. It's not actively participating in the cooling process. So from an efficiency perspective, it seems kind of weird, but at the same time, it's the way that technology and that side of the industry has gone. And I guess sitting here talking to you just kind of openly about it, it's one of those things where I think you just kind of assume that a lot of people have sat down and kind of thought this through all the way, and they've ran all the data and the math and the numbers, and they've calculated out that, hey, it makes the most sense to do it this way from a energy perspective. I'm going to assume that's true. Either way, that's not the main scope of today's conversation, and I don't have the real answers to why they didn't or they don't. But that is how the control sequences on these are happening. And we've talked about the slide valves or the variable speed. Now, there are some compressors getting into the market now, and this is, I'm going to say, fairly new in the very recent years that these have really been have been getting pushed. The technology has been around for a while, but it's a combination of slide and variable speed. So they'll put both together in the same compressor. Essentially, what that typically looks like, they'll use the slide valve as the first loading point. So the compressor will start at a minimum speed, and the slide valve will be at fully unload. Then when the compressor goes to load, they will load the slide valve to fully loaded, and then the compressor will slowly begin to ramp in speed from there. And those are your two main control points. At the same time, some of them even take it a step further and they put a hot gas bypass in on top of that. So you talk about some crazy unloading ability, and there's dangers to doing that from a compressor perspective, because you run risks of not being able to cool the compressor properly, not being able to maintain enough differential. And that's one of the things that's really critical for a screw. They need to maintain a minimum differential across them in order to keep the bolts properly torqued isn't the right term, but to keep enough pressure against them from suction to discharge in order to help them compress properly. And they'll get a bit loud and rattly if you start running really low differential pressure from suction to discharge. So I'll use like the trains, for example, the RTAA specifically. I remember this. So whatever the evaporator pressure was, the condenser had to maintain 70 psi above that. And that's about right, because a lot of screws, you really need to get at least about 60 to 70 psi before they really run smoothly. And most of them run even better, closer to 80 to 90 psi. They'll get even smoother with their operation. You'll get the bearing stacks to load properly, and everything will just get into sync with each other, and it'll just run really smooth. It's still still really freaking loud as a compressor, but in terms of a smooth operation, that's what it'll do. And if you get too low on that, you won't be able to maintain that. So it's something they have to take into consideration. So having a system that not only is variable speed, has a slide valve, and has the ability to have hot gas bypass, all three in the same system, they do it successfully. At least they have so far. I've worked on the done on bushes specifically that do that, but yeah, it just makes you ask questions, right? So anyway, that's the third style that you'll see with screws from a loading standpoint, or load control for staging, is slide and variable speed. They'll use them simultaneously, or either way, you get the point. So from a limits perspective, let's cover that to wrap this up. You'll have a low pressure limit, a high pressure limit, and a current limit. So the low pressure and high pressure limits are just like what we've been discussing. If your evaporator pressure gets down below a certain point, it's going to start limiting you to where it won't allow the compressor to stage up any further because of risk of pulling the suction pressure down. Our main goal is to keep that compressor online and make that chiller produce as much cooling as it possibly can at all times. Now, on the high pressure side, exact same line of thought. If we're starting to run high head pressure for whatever reason, dirty coils, bad fans, non-condensables, whatever, then we're going to limit how much the compressor can stage up. and it won't let it go past that. Now, moving into current limit. Now, this is a new concept for screws, and this will also apply to centrifugals when we get to that point. Something to understand, and this is kind of an odd concept. Your motor is able to, depending on the load conditions, is able to reach, say, 100% of RLA. So if we have a RLA of 200 amps, we may push that motor to 200 amps, even though our screws, our screw bolts, are not fully loaded. So just because we hit current limit doesn't mean that there's still not more CFM that compressor can technically move. The reason we're hitting our current limit is because our differential being 1, just the conditions on the compressor itself at that time are causing a lot of load on the motor, and the motor's just having to create a lot of compression, and it has a lot of torque that it's having to spin at in order to maintain the compressor speed. That's where that current limit comes into play. And then as the load comes down, as our refrigerant settles out and our conditions lower, then even though our slide or may not have moved, or we may not have sped the compressor up, our current draw will begin to fall. Yeah, let me just keep this simple from a slide perspective. So our slide may not have moved at all, but our amp draw is fluctuating, and that is evidence of the load across that compressor fluctuating due to load on the evap and the condenser and how those are interacting with the compressor. So as we are able to reduce load, we can then increase the amount of load on the compressor further as our amp draw begins to fall and we get down below our current limit. And that's where the current limit's job is to do. The current limit is there to make sure that, given certain conditions, that our compressor is not able to overload what our motor is capable of keeping up with from a torque perspective, which increases our current draw on the stator in order to keep up with that amount of work being done. I hope that makes sense, and we'll probably need to talk about this some more as we go. But whether it's a slide valve or whether it's a VFD, and we're replace slide valve with Hertz, you could think of it that way. So instead of thinking of it from a mechanical valve moving, instead it's just physical Hertz. So, or even though our Hertz may not have changed, our amp draw is. That is a weird concept if you're not already used to that, and if you've not worked with that previously. That's a weird concept, that we didn't change speed, but because our load changed, our amp draws changed. And so now we can load the compressor more, or speed it up more. So because our current draw fell, even though our Hertz remained, we can now increase our Hertz output because we're down below current limit. I really hope this is making sense. I'm trying really hard to communicate the theory here and how this works. So if you have any questions around that, please feel free to ask those. Let me try to explain it as best I can. Current limiting is the limit that this is a very important concept, and you will have to know this, and you'll need to be comfortable with this to be successful, because you're going to run into this constantly. And if you don't have your head around what's happening from a current limiting perspective, it's going to fight you, and you're going to struggle, and you're going to get really frustrated out in the field. So that's why I'm harping on it. Please. I saved it here for the last. Get your mind around this current limiting. It's really important. Anyway, that'll wrap up our staging control for a screw compressor. This is the overall process that we're going to go through, depending on the compressor type, what we're doing with it, yada yada. I'll see y'all in the next lesson.